August 17, 1943. Dawn over the English Channel. Lieutenant Robert Harmon, 23 years old, climbed into the cockpit of his P-47 Thunderbolt at RAF Manston. The air smelled of aviation fuel and sea salt. 48 other fighters were preparing for takeoff, engines coughing to life one by one across the airfield. The mission briefing had been clear. Escort B-17 bombers deep into France, protect them during the bombing run over the Renault factory outside Paris, bring everyone home. Simple on paper. Deadly in practice. Harmon had flown 17 missions. 17 times over occupied Europe. 17 times he'd watched other aircraft spiral down trailing smoke and fire. He knew the statistics. 1 in 4 fighter pilots didn't survive their tour. The odds improved if you stayed alert, followed formation discipline, kept your eyes moving. The Thunderbolt's engine roared to life. 8 cylinders, 2,000 horsepower, the sound so loud it made your chest vibrate. Harmon ran through his pre-flight checks by muscle memory. Fuel mixture, propeller pitch, gun sight, oxygen system. Everything had to work perfectly at 25,000 feet where the air was thin as death and the cold could freeze your blood in seconds. The bomber formation appeared on schedule. 36 B-17s in tight boxes, each one carrying 10 men and 6 tons of bombs. The fighters formed up around them like shepherds guarding a flock. They climbed together, the bombers slow and heavy, the fighters circling protectively, all of them heading east toward France. Below, the channel disappeared. The French coast appeared, a thin dark line that grew into fields and villages and roads. Somewhere down there, German radar operators were tracking their formation, calculating intercept courses, scrambling fighters from a dozen airfields. The Germans always knew you were coming. The only question was when they'd arrive and in what numbers. The bomber stream droned deeper into France. Harmon scanned the sky constantly. Left, right, above, below, behind. That's where death came from. A fighter you didn't see, diving out of the sun with guns blazing before you could react. He'd watched 3 friends die that way. Good pilots, experienced men, killed in the 2 seconds it took for cannon shells to tear through aluminum and flesh. The formation reached the initial point. The bombers began their final approach to the target. This was the most dangerous phase. Straight and level flight, no evasive action, while anti-aircraft batteries below fired shells programmed to explode at exactly their altitude. Black puffs appeared around the bombers, each one a burst of shrapnel that could shred metal and men with equal ease. Then the German fighters arrived. They came from above and ahead, diving through the bomber formation at 400 miles per hour. Focke-Wulf 190s, the best fighters the Luftwaffe had. Harmon broke toward them, thumb on the gun trigger, his Thunderbolt accelerating into the attack. The sky became chaos. Bombers, fighters, tracer rounds, smoke trails, aircraft wheeling and diving in all directions. He fired at a Focke-Wulf that crossed his path. Saw his tracers converge on the enemy fighter's wing. Pieces flew off. The German rolled inverted and dove away trailing white smoke. Harmon didn't follow. Never leave the bombers. That was the rule that kept everyone alive. Another Focke-Wulf appeared directly ahead, coming straight at him in a head-on pass. Both pilots fired simultaneously. The closure rate was over 700 miles per hour. They had perhaps 2 seconds. Harmon's 850 caliber machine guns hammered, the recoil shaking the entire aircraft. He saw flashes on the German's nose as the enemy pilot's cannon fired back. Something hit his Thunderbolt. Art. The aircraft shuddered. A sound like someone hitting a steel drum with a hammer. His left wing erupted in flame. Orange fire streamed back from the engine cowling. The cockpit filled with smoke. Temperature gauges spiked into the red. Oil pressure dropped to 0. The engine was dying. The fire was spreading. Harmon rolled inverted and dove, trying to blow out the flames with speed. It didn't work. The fire grew worse, eating through the wing structure, melting aluminum, working its way toward the fuel tanks. He had maybe 30 seconds before the entire wing came off or the fuel ignited. He was at 18,000 feet over occupied France. 60 miles from the English Channel. The bomber formation continued toward the target without him, already 5 miles away and pulling further ahead every second. His fighter was burning, the controls getting sluggish as fire destroyed the hydraulic lines and cables. 30 seconds became 20. The smoke in the cockpit was choking him. He couldn't see the instrument panel. His eyes watered. The heat through the floor was intense, metal expanding, rivets popping loose from the stress. The aircraft wanted to roll left, pulled by the damaged wing. Harmon fought the stick but he was losing. 20 seconds became 10. He reached for the canopy release, pulled the emergency handle. The canopy jettisoned, ripped away by the 300-mile-per-hour wind. Cold air rushed in, clearing the smoke momentarily. He could see again. The left wing was fully engulfed, the fire now reaching back past the cockpit toward the tail. He unstrapped his harness. Disconnected his oxygen mask, his radio lead, his survival equipment. Pulled his knees up to his chest. Rolled the aircraft inverted again. And let himself fall out. The wind hit him like a wall. Spinning, tumbling, the ground and sky rotating in a nauseating blur. He spread his arms and legs trying to stabilize. The earth was below him, green fields and small villages growing larger every second. He was at 16,000 feet and falling at 120 miles per hour. Above him, his Thunderbolt continued its death spiral. The burning fighter carved a black smoke trail across the sky, visible for 30 miles in every direction. It rolled slowly, almost gracefully, the flames now consuming the entire aircraft. Then the fuel tanks exploded. A bright flash, an expanding fireball, pieces of aircraft scattering outward like shrapnel from a bomb. Harmon counted to 10, then pulled his ripcord. The parachute deployed with a violent jerk that nearly broke his spine. His descent slowed from 120 miles per hour to 15 in less than 2 seconds. Straps cut into his shoulders and thighs. He looked up to check the canopy. Clean deployment, no rips, no tangles. The white silk parachute filled with air above him, holding him suspended between sky and earth. Now he had perhaps 5 minutes to figure out how to survive. He was drifting east, carried by high-altitude winds toward a small village he could see below. Around him the sky was empty. The bomber formation had disappeared toward the target. The German fighters had broken off, probably low on fuel and ammunition. He was alone, floating down into enemy territory with no weapons, no radio, no way to call for help. The ground rushed up. Fields, a road, houses with red tile roofs. He could see people looking up, pointing at him. French civilians. Or German soldiers. He wouldn't know until he landed. The trees were getting closer now. Individual branches visible. He pulled on his risers, trying to steer away from a cluster of buildings toward an open field. The impact came hard. His feet hit the ground and his knees buckled. He rolled sideways through wheat stalks, the parachute collapsing around him like a dying jellyfish. For a moment he lay still, checking for injuries. Nothing broken. Bruised shoulder, twisted ankle, otherwise intact. He gathered up his parachute, bundling the white silk into his arms. It was evidence, a marker that would bring Germans running if they saw it. He needed to hide it quickly. The nearest cover was a tree line about 200 yards away. He started running. Each step sent pain through his twisted ankle. Behind him, a church bell began ringing. The village was alerting someone. In occupied France, that could mean German soldiers or French resistance or simply frightened civilians reporting a crashed pilot to the authorities. He didn't know who was coming. But someone was. The farmhouse appeared suddenly through the wheat field. Stone walls, a slate roof, windows shuttered against the August sun. Harmon crouched at the edge of the tree line, watching for movement. No vehicles. No soldiers. Just a weathered building that looked like it had stood for 200 years. Behind him, he could hear voices from the village. German voices. Sharp commands, boots on cobblestone. They were organizing a search. He had maybe 10 minutes before they began sweeping the fields in formation. He buried his parachute under a pile of brush near the tree line, covering it with dead leaves and fallen branches. The white silk disappeared beneath the camouflage. Then he moved toward the farmhouse, limping on his injured ankle, staying low in the wheat. A dog began barking. A small brown mutt that came charging around the corner of the house, teeth bared. Harmon froze. The dog stopped 10 feet away, growling but not attacking. Behind it, the farmhouse door opened. An old woman stepped out. She was perhaps 65, wearing a dark dress and an apron stained with flour. Her gray hair was pulled back in a bun. She looked at Harmon, then at the dog, then back at Harmon. Her expression didn't change. No surprise, no fear, just a kind of weary recognition. She said something in French. Harmon shook his head, not understanding. He pointed to himself. American. Pilot. American. The woman glanced toward the village where German voices were getting louder. She made a decision. She gestured sharply toward the house. Vite. Quickly. Harmon followed her inside. She closed the door behind him and latched it. The interior was dark, cool, smelling of bread and old wood. She led him through a kitchen where a pot of soup simmered on a cast-iron stove, then to a narrow staircase. Up the stairs, down a hallway into a small bedroom. She pointed to a wardrobe against one wall. Spoke in rapid French. Harmon understood the gesture if not the words. He opened the wardrobe. It was empty except for a few old coats. The woman pushed aside the coats and knocked on the back panel. It swung inward on hidden hinges, revealing a cramped space about 4 feet deep. A hiding place. Built specifically for this purpose. Harmon climbed inside. The space was barely large enough for him to sit with his knees drawn up. The woman closed the false panel. Then closed the wardrobe doors. Darkness. Complete and absolute. He heard her footsteps retreating down the hallway. He sat in the dark and waited. Time passed. Maybe minutes, maybe an hour. He couldn't tell. His twisted ankle throbbed. His back ached from the cramped position. The air in the hiding space grew warm and stale. He tried to stay calm, breathing slowly, listening to sounds from the house below. Then he heard boots. Multiple pairs. Heavy footsteps on the stairs. German voices, sharp and aggressive. They were searching the house room by room. Doors slamming open. Furniture being moved. The systematic thoroughness of men who knew what they were looking for. The bedroom door opened. Footsteps across the wooden floor. A man speaking in German asking questions. The old woman's voice responding, calm and steady, saying something Harmon couldn't understand. More footsteps. Closer now. Directly in front of the wardrobe. The wardrobe doors opened. Light appeared through the cracks in the false panel. Harmon held his breath. He could hear a German soldier breathing on the other side of the thin wooden partition. The soldier said something. The woman responded. There was a long pause. Then the wardrobe doors closed. The footsteps retreated. More talking getting fainter. The bedroom door closed. Voices fading down the stairs. The front door slamming. Then silence. Harmon remained motionless for another hour. Maybe the Germans had left. Maybe they were waiting outside watching the house. He had no way to know. Finally the wardrobe opened. The false panel swung back. The old woman's face appeared, illuminated by lamplight. Part 1, she said. Gone. She helped him out of the hiding space. His legs had gone numb from sitting so long. He hobbled to the window and looked out carefully. The yard was empty. The fields showed no movement. The Germans had moved their search elsewhere. The woman gestured for him to follow her downstairs. In the kitchen, she ladled soup into a bowl and placed it on the table. A thick vegetable broth with chunks of potato and carrot. She set down a piece of bread beside it, dark and dense. Harmon realized he hadn't eaten since before dawn. He ate while the woman watched from across the kitchen. When he finished, she brought him cheese and an apple. He tried to thank her but had no French words. He gestured helplessly. She waved away his gratitude with one flour-dusted hand. A man entered through the back door. He was perhaps 40, wearing farmer's clothes, his face weathered and hard. He looked at Harmon without expression, then spoke rapidly to the woman in French. They argued briefly. The woman won. The man shrugged and sat down heavily at the table. The woman brought Harmon to understand through gestures and simple words that her name was Madame Rousseau. The man was her son, Pierre. They ran the farm alone since Monsieur Rousseau had died 3 years ago. The Germans occupied the village. They came regularly to requisition food, search for resistance members, and enforce their countless regulations. Hiding an Allied pilot was punishable by death. Not just for the person hiding him but for their family. The entire household. The Germans had made this clear through public executions in towns throughout France. Madame Rousseau knew this. Pierre knew this. They were hiding Harmon anyway. That night, Pierre brought news from the village. The Germans had found the parachute. They knew an Allied pilot was in the area. They were establishing roadblocks on every road leading out of the village. House-to-house searches would continue for days. The pilot couldn't stay at the farm. Too dangerous. But he couldn't leave either. Not yet. For 3 days, Harmon remained hidden in the false compartment behind the wardrobe. Madame Rousseau brought him food twice a day. Bread, cheese, soup, whatever they could spare from their own meager rations. Pierre brought news of the search. The Germans were thorough, methodical, angry. They knew the pilot was receiving help. They wanted to make an example. On the 4th day, Pierre announced that arrangements had been made. A man from the village, someone connected to the resistance, would come that night to take Harmon to the next safe house. From there, he would be passed along a chain of helpers stretching all the way to Spain. It would take weeks, maybe months. But it was possible to reach freedom. That evening, Harmon sat in the kitchen with Madame Rousseau and Pierre. They shared a meal of potatoes and rabbit that Pierre had trapped. The conversation was limited by language, but something passed between them that needed no words. They were risking everything for a stranger. An enemy technically, since France had fallen and was now controlled by Germany. But they saw him as something else. A young man far from home. Someone's son. Someone fighting the same evil they lived under every day. Madame Rousseau cut him an extra portion of rabbit. Pierre poured him a small glass of wine they'd been saving. Harmon tried to find words to express what this meant, but nothing seemed adequate. Thank you was too small. These people were giving him life itself. Near midnight there was a soft knock at the back door. Pierre opened it cautiously. A thin man in worker's clothes slipped inside. He nodded to Pierre, glanced briefly at Harmon, then spoke quickly in French. Time to go. Harmon stood. His ankle had healed enough to walk without limping. Madame Rousseau gave him a cloth bag with bread and cheese for the journey. Pierre handed him a worn jacket that would help him blend in. The thin man gestured toward the door. They needed to leave immediately. At the threshold, Harmon turned back. Madame Rousseau was watching him with an expression he couldn't quite read. Sadness perhaps. Or fear for what might happen to him on the long road ahead. Or maybe just the look of someone who had done what conscience demanded, regardless of the cost. He wanted to tell her she had saved his life. That he would never forget her. That if he survived the war he would come back and thank her properly. But he had no French words and no time. So he simply nodded. She nodded back. Then he stepped out into the darkness with a stranger who might lead him to freedom or betray him to the Germans. He had no way to know which. The bicycle had no lights. They rode in darkness along narrow farm roads, avoiding the main highway where German patrols moved at irregular intervals. The thin man whose name Harmon never learned navigated from memory, steering around potholes and ruts that would have thrown them into ditches. They rode for 3 hours. Past silent farmhouses. Through sleeping villages where dogs barked at their passage. Around German checkpoints that appeared as faint lights in the distance. The man seemed to know where every patrol would be before they arrived. Dawn was breaking when they reached a barn on the outskirts of another village. The man stopped, dismounted, gestured for Harmon to follow. Inside the barn they climbed a ladder to a hayloft. The man pointed to a pile of hay in the corner, made a sleeping gesture, then disappeared back down the ladder. Harmon buried himself in the hay and slept. When he woke, daylight was streaming through gaps in the barn walls. Below him he could hear farm animals moving, someone milking a cow. Normal sounds. He remained still, waiting. In the afternoon a young woman climbed the ladder. She was perhaps 25, dressed in a simple cotton dress, her dark hair tied back with a ribbon. She carried a basket covered with a cloth. She didn't look directly at him, but placed the basket near his hiding spot and climbed back down without a word. Under the cloth was bread, hard cheese, a bottle of water, and a small note written in English. Stay quiet. Leave tonight. He ate. He waited. He listened to the sounds of the farm below. A child laughing. A man calling to chickens. A truck passing on the road. The ordinary life of occupied France, where every day was a performance of normalcy over constant fear. That night a different man came. Older, with a grizzled beard and hands that looked like they'd been carved from wood. He led Harmon to a cart loaded with hay, gestured for him to climb in, covered him completely with loose hay, then climbed onto the driver's seat and started the cart moving. They traveled for hours. Harmon lay in scratchy darkness, breathing through a small air pocket, feeling every bump and jolt. Once the cart stopped. German voices. The driver responding calmly. A long pause. Then laughter. The cart moving again. When they finally stopped and the hay was pulled away, Harmon found himself in a forest clearing. 3 men stood watching him. One wore a beret and carried an old rifle. Another had a pistol tucked into his belt. The third was young, barely 20, with intelligent eyes and nervous hands. They spoke no English. He spoke no French. But they fed him, gave him wine, found him a place to sleep in a woodcutter's shelter. In the morning they brought him civilian clothes that fit poorly but looked French enough. They gave him false identity papers that identified him as a deaf-mute farm worker. If stopped by Germans he was to show the papers and remain silent. For 6 weeks Harmon moved through the network. Each stop lasted anywhere from 1 night to 5 days. Each guide knew only the next connection in the chain, never the complete route. Security through compartmentalization. If one person was caught and tortured they couldn't betray the entire network. He stayed in attics and cellars and barns. He slept in hay and on bare earth and once in a priest's bed while the priest slept on the floor. He was fed by farmers and factory workers and shopkeepers and a doctor's widow who apologized for having so little to share. Each person knew the risk. The Germans had made it clear through executions and deportations. Helping Allied evaders meant death. Sometimes death for your entire family. Sometimes death for your entire village. They helped anyway. A baker who hid him in a storage room beneath his shop. A schoolteacher who let him sleep in her attic while German officers were billeted in the rooms below. A railway worker who smuggled him past a checkpoint by disguising him as an injured laborer being transported to a hospital. Every person in the chain was ordinary. They weren't soldiers or trained resistance fighters. They were civilians who could have stayed safe by doing nothing. By looking the other way. By thinking only of themselves and their families. Instead they chose risk. They chose conscience over safety. In a farmhouse near Lyon, Harmon spent 4 days recovering from an infected cut on his leg. The farmer's wife treated the wound with homemade antiseptic and clean bandages she'd been saving. She sat with him through a fever, bathing his forehead with cool water, feeding him broth when he could barely swallow. Her husband told him through gestures that they'd had a son. A pilot in the French Air Force who died in 1940 during the German invasion. The photograph on the mantel showed a young man in a leather flying jacket, smiling at the camera. The same age Harmon had been when the war started. He understood then why they helped. Not for politics or patriotism or grand ideals. But because of the simple, stubborn insistence that decency mattered. That you help someone in need even at great cost to yourself. Especially at great cost. In a village near the Swiss border things went wrong. His guide, a teenager who couldn't have been older than 17, led him toward what should have been his last safe house before crossing into Switzerland. But German soldiers appeared at an intersection ahead. The guide grabbed Harmon's arm, pulled him into an alley. They ran. Shouts behind them. Boots pounding on cobblestone. The sharp crack of a rifle shot. The guide stumbled, caught himself, kept running. They ducked through a garden gate, over a low wall into someone's yard. A door opened. An elderly man pulled them inside. The guide collapsed on the floor. Blood spread across his shirt from a wound high on his shoulder. The elderly man and his wife worked quickly, efficiently, like they'd done this before. They stripped away the guide's shirt, packed the wound with cloth, wrapped it tight. The bullet had passed through muscle without hitting bone or major vessels. He would live if infection didn't set in. German soldiers were sweeping through the neighborhood. House-to-house searches. The elderly couple hid both Harmon and the wounded guide in a fruit cellar beneath the kitchen floor. They waited in darkness while boots tramped overhead. Harsh voices demanding to search the premises. The elderly man's calm responses. The woman's timid agreement. The soldiers searched for 30 minutes. Then left. The elderly couple kept them hidden for a week while the guide healed. They shared their food, changed his bandages, risked their lives for two strangers they would probably never see again. Finally, arrangements were made. A different guide would take Harmon the final distance to Switzerland. The wounded teenager would recover here until he was strong enough to return to his own village. On Harmon's last night in France, the elderly man drew him a map showing the route to the border. He pointed to landmarks, explained in broken English mixed with French and gestures where the crossing would be safest. When he finished, he folded the map carefully and tucked it into Harmon's jacket pocket. Then he did something unexpected. He embraced Harmon. Not a handshake or formal gesture, but a genuine embrace. The kind you give a son before a long journey. The woman hugged him too, tears in her eyes. Harmon realized they weren't crying for him. They were crying for everyone they'd helped. All the pilots and soldiers and refugees who had passed through their home, moving along the invisible chain toward freedom. Some made it. Some didn't. They would never know which was which. The next day, Harmon crossed into Switzerland with a guide who left him at the border fence and disappeared back into occupied France without a word. Swiss border guards found him within an hour, confused and exhausted, barely able to explain who he was or where he'd come from. He was free. Behind him, in France, the network continued operating. The farmers and teachers and bakers and railway workers and elderly couples continued hiding pilots, forging papers, passing strangers along from hand to hand. The Germans continued searching, arresting, executing anyone they caught. Some were caught. Some were never caught. The network shifted and adapted, closing gaps when people disappeared, opening new routes when old ones became too dangerous. Years later, after the war ended, Harmon tried to find the people who had saved him. Madame Rousseau, Pierre, the baker, the schoolteacher, the farmer's wife who nursed his fever, the elderly couple who hid him in their fruit cellar. He found some. He never found others. Some had survived the war. Some had been betrayed and arrested. Some had simply disappeared into the chaos of liberation and its aftermath. Those he did find refused recognition. They were embarrassed by his gratitude. They insisted they'd done nothing special. Just what anyone would do. What conscience demanded. They didn't see themselves as heroes. Just people who'd made a choice when a choice was required. September 1944. Paris liberated. The Germans retreating across France. Harmon flew again, now from bases in liberated territory, escorting bombers deeper into Germany. He completed his combat tour. 50 missions. He survived. But something had changed. Before he was shot down, the war had been simple. Us against them. Good versus evil. You flew your missions, you killed the enemy, you didn't think too deeply about what it all meant. After France, nothing was simple anymore. He'd seen the enemy. Not soldiers in uniform, but ordinary Germans living in occupied territory. And he'd seen the opposite of enemies. French civilians who should have been safe if they just kept their heads down, who instead risked everything for a stranger who spoke a different language and came from a place they'd never seen. The war continued without pause. More missions. More bombing raids. More German cities burning. Dresden, Frankfurt, Berlin. Strategic targets, military objectives, necessary to win the war. That's what the briefings said. That's what everyone believed. Harmon looked down from 25,000 feet at the fires spreading below and thought about Madame Rousseau's kitchen. The soup she'd shared even though food was rationed. The risk she'd taken for someone she'd never see again. He wondered what happened to people like her when bombers came. When the strategic targets included the roads they lived on, the railways they worked beside, the cities where they bought their meager supplies. The war ended in May 1945. Victory celebrations across America. Harmon returned home to a small town in Nebraska. Everyone wanted to hear about his adventures. He told them about dogfights and bomber escorts and close calls over Germany. He didn't tell them about France. How do you explain to people who've never been hungry that an old woman gave you half her bread? How do you make them understand that complete strangers risked death just so you could go home to a place they would never see? The words didn't exist. So he stopped trying to explain. He married in 1947. Had 3 children. Worked as a flight instructor at a small airport, teaching young men to fly. Sometimes, late at night, he would try to tell his wife about France. About the network of hands that passed him toward safety. About ordinary people choosing courage when they could have chosen safety. She listened. She understood as much as anyone could who hadn't been there. But the weight of it remained his to carry. In 1975, 32 years after being shot down, Harmon received a letter from France. It was from a woman named Marie Rousseau, identifying herself as the granddaughter of Madame Rousseau. Her grandmother had died in 1968. Before her death, she told her family about the American pilot she'd hidden during the war. She'd asked Marie to try to find him if possible, to let him know she had survived. Harmon wrote back immediately. He told Marie everything he'd wanted to say that night when he left the farmhouse. That her grandmother had saved his life. That he'd thought of her thousands of times over the years. That he would never forget her kindness. Marie replied with more details. Madame Rousseau had hidden 8 different Allied pilots during the war. Pierre had been arrested by the Germans in 1944 for resistance activities but had survived imprisonment and returned home after liberation. The farmhouse still stood, though it was no longer in the family. They exchanged letters for years. Marie sent photographs of the farmhouse, of the village, of the tree line where Harmon had buried his parachute. He sent her photographs of his family, his life in America, his career teaching young pilots to fly. In 1980, Harmon traveled back to France. Marie met him at the train station. She was in her 40s, a schoolteacher, married with 2 children. She drove him to the village. It looked smaller than he remembered. The farmhouse was there, exactly as it had been, though someone else lived in it now. They stood in the yard where Madame Rousseau had first seen him. The tree line was still visible across the field. Harmon tried to imagine the scared young man he'd been, limping toward the house with a twisted ankle and no plan, hoping whoever lived there would help rather than betray him. Marie introduced him to several people in the village who remembered the war years. An elderly man who'd been part of the local resistance. A woman who'd helped hide down pilots in her cellar. A former railway worker who'd smuggled evaders past German checkpoints. None of them wanted to be called heroes. They were uncomfortable with gratitude. They'd done what needed doing, nothing more. The real heroes were the ones who'd been caught. The ones who'd been shot or sent to concentration camps. The ones who never came home. Harmon met one of those heroes. Or rather, he met the man's widow. Her husband had been a baker in the village. He'd hidden Allied evaders in his shop's storage rooms. In 1944, the Germans discovered his activities. They arrested him, tortured him for information, then executed him by firing squad as an example to others. His wife showed Harmon the plaque the French government had installed on the bakery wall. It listed her husband's name and 3 others from the village who'd been killed for resistance activities. She served Harmon coffee in her small apartment above what used to be the bakery. She was in her 70s now, white-haired, bent with age. She spoke about her husband matter-of-factly, without sentiment. He'd been a good man. He believed in helping people. When the war came, he did what he thought was right. He paid the price. She didn't cry. She didn't ask for pity. She simply stated the facts. Harmon realized she'd been stating those same facts for 36 years. To herself. To her children. To anyone who asked. The repetition had worn away the emotion, leaving only the truth. Her husband had died so pilots like Harmon could live. There was no way to repay that debt. No words adequate. No gesture sufficient. Before leaving France, Harmon visited the American cemetery at Normandy. Thousands of white crosses stretched across the hillside overlooking Omaha Beach. He walked among them, reading names, looking at ages. So many were 20, 22, 24. The same age he'd been when his Thunderbolt caught fire over France. He'd survived because strangers saved him. These men had died fighting so those same strangers could be free. The symmetry was almost unbearable. June 2003. Harmon was 83 years old. His wife had died the previous year. His children were grown, scattered across America with families of their own. He lived alone in a modest house in Nebraska, still driving, still sharp, but increasingly aware of time's limits. A documentary film crew contacted him. They were making a film about the French resistance and wanted to interview veterans who'd been helped by the evasion networks. Would he be willing to participate? He agreed. They came to his house with cameras and lights and a young director who couldn't have been older than his grandchildren. They asked him to tell the story of being shot down. He told them about the fire, the bailout, landing in the wheat field. Then they asked him to talk about the people who helped him. He started with Madame Rousseau. The flower on her hands. The way she'd hidden him without hesitation. The meals she'd shared even though food was scarce. As he talked, 60 years collapsed. He was back in that kitchen, watching her ladle soup into a bowl, her face calm despite the danger. The director asked if he'd been afraid. Harmon thought about it. Yes, but not of the Germans. Not really. He'd been afraid of getting these people killed. Of being the reason German soldiers came to their door. Of having someone's death on his conscience because they tried to save him. The interview lasted 3 hours. The director kept asking for more details. The names of villages. The occupations of people who'd helped him. The specific routes he'd traveled. Harmon provided what he remembered, but 60 years had blurred many details. What remained sharp were faces. Hands placing food on a table. Doors opening in darkness. Ordinary people doing extraordinary things because they believed it mattered. The documentary aired in 2004. Harmon watched it in his living room. The film included interviews with French survivors of the resistance. Men and women now in their 80s, their voices strong despite age, their memories precise. One woman described hiding Allied pilots in her attic while German officers were quartered in her house. She spoke about the terror of walking upstairs with food for the hidden men, knowing that discovery meant death for everyone. She did it anyway. Every day for 6 months. Then the war ended and the pilots went home and she went back to teaching school. A man described being arrested by the Gestapo and tortured for information about the resistance networks. He refused to talk. They broke his hands with hammers. He still refused. After 3 weeks they sent him to a concentration camp. He survived. Barely. When asked why he didn't tell them what they wanted to know, he shrugged. Because others would have died. That's not complicated. Harmon recognized something in these people. The same matter-of-fact courage Madame Rousseau had shown. The same refusal to see themselves as special. They'd done what needed doing. That was all. The documentary sparked renewed interest in the escape and evasion networks. Historians began documenting routes and safe houses and the names of people who'd participated. Museums in France and Belgium installed exhibits about the ordinary civilians who'd saved Allied lives at great personal risk. Harmon was invited to speak at a ceremony honoring the French resistance. He stood before an audience of several hundred people, French veterans, American veterans, families of resistance members, young people who'd never known war, and tried to explain what it meant to be saved by strangers. He told them about the farmer's wife who'd nursed his fever, the elderly couple who'd hidden him in their fruit cellar, the baker who'd been executed for helping people like him. He told them that he'd lived 75 years after being shot down. He'd had a career, a family, grandchildren, a whole life that never would have happened if not for people who chose courage. At the end of his speech he said something he'd been thinking about for 60 years. We remember soldiers who died in battle. We build monuments to them. We should. They earned it. But we forget the civilians who fought without uniforms, who resisted without recognition, who saved lives by simply opening their doors to strangers. History doesn't record most of their names. There are no monuments to the woman who shared her bread or the man who forged identity papers or the family who hid a frightened pilot in their attic. But they won the war just as much as any soldier. Maybe more. The audience applauded. After the ceremony people lined up to shake his hand. Some were children and grandchildren of resistance members. They told stories their parents had rarely shared. The fear. The close calls. The pride in having done the right thing when it mattered most. An elderly French woman approached him last. She was perhaps 90, frail, leaning heavily on a cane. She introduced herself in accented English. She'd been a teenager during the war. Her family had hidden Allied pilots in their barn. One night, German soldiers came searching. Her mother distracted them while her father hurried the pilot out the back and into the woods. The Germans left. The pilot escaped. Her mother died of a heart attack the next day. The stress had been too much for her. The woman looked at Harmon with clear eyes. My mother saved 5 pilots. She died saving the 5th one. I want you to know she never regretted it. Not once. She told me before she died that it was the most important thing she ever did. Harmon had no words. He simply took the woman's hand and held it. 2 old people connected by a war that had ended 6 decades ago but still echoed through every day of their lives. Late 2003. Harmon began writing his memoirs. His children had been asking him to do it for years. Now, with time running short and memory beginning to fade, he finally started. He wrote about his childhood in Nebraska. About learning to fly before the war. About joining the Army Air Corps after Pearl Harbor. About training as a fighter pilot. About his first combat mission and the terror that never fully went away no matter how many missions you flew. Then he reached the part about being shot down. He wrote about the fire, the bailout, landing in France. He described Madame Rousseau, Pierre, the network of people who'd passed him along toward Switzerland. He wrote about faces and meals and close calls and ordinary people making impossible choices. And then he stopped. Because there was a question he'd been avoiding for 60 years. A question that felt ungrateful to even ask. But the question remained, insistent, demanding acknowledgement. Why did they help? Not the simple answer. Not because they were good people, or because it was the right thing to do. Those were true but incomplete. The real question was deeper. Why did some people risk death to help strangers while others informed on their neighbors? Why did Madame Rousseau open her door while the next house over might have called the Germans? What made Pierre decide to join the resistance when most men his age kept their heads down and survived? Harmon had asked this question of several people during his trips back to France. Their answers were frustratingly modest. Someone needed help. It was necessary. We couldn't just do nothing. But that was the thing. They could have done nothing. Most people did nothing. Most people survived the war by being invisible, by cooperating just enough to avoid suspicion, by telling themselves that individual resistance didn't matter. Those people weren't wrong. Individual resistance usually didn't matter. The Germans were too strong, too organized, too ruthless. One person hiding one pilot wouldn't change the war's outcome. The rational choice was to stay safe, protect your family, survive. So why did some people choose the irrational path? Harmon wrote about this in his memoir. He described the ordinary people who'd saved him and tried to understand what separated them from neighbors who would have turned him in. He couldn't find a pattern. The resistors included wealthy and poor, educated and illiterate, religious and atheist, young and old. The only commonality he could identify was this: they all seemed to possess an internal compass that pointed toward conscience regardless of consequences. They weren't calculating odds or weighing costs. They were simply incapable of closing the door on someone who needed help. It was almost a defect. A failure of self-preservation instinct that should have been bred out of humans centuries ago. Except it wasn't a defect. It was the thing that made them fully human. Late in his memoir, Harmon wrote about a conversation he'd had with a French resistance member in the 1980s. The man had hidden dozens of Allied evaders during the war. He'd been arrested twice, escaped once, survived imprisonment the second time. After the war, he'd returned to his job as a clerk in a government office. Nothing special. Nothing heroic. Harmon had asked him the question directly. Why did you do it? You could have been killed. The man had looked at him with genuine confusion. How could I not? He'd said. They were human beings who needed help. What else was I supposed to do? That was the answer. The only answer. Not complex philosophy or political ideology or calculated risk assessment. Just a simple, almost childlike insistence that you help people who needed help. Even if it cost you everything. Harmon finished his memoir in 2004. His children published it through a small press. It sold modestly, mostly to veterans organizations and World War II history enthusiasts. He did a few book signings at local stores. People thanked him for his service. He thanked them for listening. But he knew the real story wasn't his. It belonged to Madame Rousseau and Pierre and all the others whose names he never learned. People who fought a different kind of war. Without uniforms. Without recognition. Without any certainty that their actions mattered. They fought anyway. With bread and false papers and hidden compartments behind wardrobes. With courage that looked like simple hospitality. That was the war Harmon wanted people to remember. I stood here, he said. I could hear German voices from the village. I could see the farmhouse. I didn't know if I should run toward it or hide in the woods. I was 23 years old and absolutely terrified. He looked at the farmhouse, still visible across the field. And then she came outside. An old woman I'd never met. She looked at me for maybe 5 seconds. Then she waved me toward the house. 5 seconds to make a decision that could have gotten her killed. She didn't hesitate. They stood in silence. 3 generations connected by a moment that had lasted 5 seconds but echoed across 63 years. Sarah spoke quietly. Dad, why didn't you tell us these stories when we were growing up? Harmon considered the question. Because I didn't know how. And because it felt like something I didn't deserve. All these people risking their lives for me. I was just a pilot who got shot down. I didn't do anything special. But they. He gestured toward the farmhouse. They chose courage every single day. How do you explain that to children? By telling them, Sarah said. By making sure we remember. They returned to the village for one final ceremony. The local mayor had arranged a small gathering at the town hall. Perhaps 50 people attended, mostly elderly, a few younger ones who came out of respect for their grandparents' generation. The mayor gave a brief speech about the resistance, about the ordinary citizens who'd sheltered Allied evaders, about the price they'd paid. Then he asked Harmon if he'd like to say anything. Harmon stood slowly, gripping the podium for support. He looked at the faces watching him. People who'd lived through the war. People who remembered the occupation, the fear, the impossible choices. I was saved by strangers, he said. That's the simplest way to say it. I owed you nothing. You owed me nothing. But you saved my life anyway. You risked everything for someone you'd never see again. I've spent 63 years trying to understand why. I've asked dozens of you. I've read books. I've thought about it every day of my life. And I finally realized I'll never fully understand. Because what you did doesn't make sense in rational terms. It only makes sense if you believe that human decency matters more than personal safety. That conscience is worth dying for. That helping someone, anyone, is reason enough to risk everything. I lived 75 years after you saved me. I had a career. A family. I taught hundreds of young people to fly. I got to grow old. All of that happened because you opened your doors when you could have kept them locked. I can't repay that. There's no way to balance the equation. But I can promise you this. I've told your story to everyone who would listen. I've written it down. I've made sure my children and grandchildren know what you did. And I hope that somewhere, sometime, one of them will face a moment when they have to choose between safety and conscience. And I hope they'll remember you. And I hope they'll choose the way you chose. Because that's how your courage echoes forward. Not through monuments or medals. But through the example you set. The standard you raised. The proof you gave that ordinary people can do extraordinary things when they simply refuse to close the door on someone who needs help. He sat down. The room was silent. Then someone began clapping. Then everyone. Not enthusiastic applause. Quiet, respectful, acknowledging something that couldn't quite be put into words. After the ceremony, people approached him, shook his hand, thanked him for remembering. An elderly woman gave him a small photograph, her father, a resistance courier who'd been killed in 1944. She wanted Harmon to have it, to remember. He promised he would. That night, in his hotel room, Harmon added the photograph to his collection. Dozens of faces. Some he'd met personally. Most he knew only through stories and documents. All of them part of the invisible network that had saved his life and countless others. He thought about the baker who died in front of a firing squad. The teenager who'd been shot while guiding him toward Switzerland. Madame Rousseau, who died peacefully in her bed decades after the war, never seeking recognition for what she'd done. These people hadn't fought for glory. They'd fought because they couldn't not fight. Because their sense of right and wrong wouldn't allow them to close the door on someone who needed help. That was the real victory. Not military strategy or superior weapons or grand historical forces. Just individual human beings choosing conscience over convenience. Kindness over fear. Others over self. One person at a time. One door opened at a time. One life saved at a time. That was how evil lost. Not through armies, but through the quiet, stubborn courage of people who simply refused to participate in cruelty. Harmon fell asleep thinking about Madame Rousseau's kitchen. The soup. The bread. The small act of sharing that contained everything worth remembering about the war. Spring 2006. Harmon was 86. His health was failing. Diabetes, heart problems, the accumulated weight of age. His doctor told him to stay home, rest, take his medications. Instead, he booked a flight to France. His children objected. He was too old, too fragile to travel alone. He insisted. They compromised. His daughter Sarah agreed to accompany him. Just in case. They flew to Paris, then took a train south to the village where Madame Rousseau's farmhouse still stood. Marie met them at the station. She was 61 now, recently retired from teaching. She'd arranged for them to visit all the places Harmon remembered from 1943. First, the farmhouse. The current owners had agreed to let them visit. The house looked exactly as it had 63 years ago. Same stone walls. Same slate roof. Same window where Harmon had watched for German soldiers. Inside, the wardrobe was still there in the upstairs bedroom. The current owners knew its history. They'd kept it as a reminder. Harmon opened the wardrobe doors, pushed aside the coats, found the false panel. It swung open on the same hidden hinges. He stared at the cramped space where he'd hidden while German soldiers searched the room. He couldn't fit in there anymore. Age and infirmity had made it impossible. But he remembered the darkness, the fear, the sound of boots on the floor outside. And he remembered the courage it took for Madame Rousseau to stand between him and those soldiers. To lie convincingly. To risk her life for someone she'd known for less than an hour. That evening, Marie hosted a dinner at her home. She'd invited several elderly people from the village who remembered the war. They shared a meal, simple food, wine, conversation that mixed French and English in equal measure. One man, 92 years old, had been part of the local resistance. He remembered the network that moved Allied evaders south toward the border. He'd been a courier, carrying messages between safe houses, never knowing the full picture, just doing his small part. He told Harmon about a pilot he'd helped in 1944. An American bomber crewman who'd been badly injured when he bailed out. The man had broken both legs. He couldn't walk. The resistance had hidden him for 4 months while his legs healed. 4 months in an attic, unable to move, completely dependent on strangers for everything. The pilot eventually made it back to Allied lines after the liberation. The resistance members never learned his name. Never heard from him again. They had no idea if he survived the rest of the war. That's how it was, the old man said. You help someone. They disappeared. You never knew what happened to them. You just hoped they made it. Harmon thought about all the people who'd helped him. The ones he'd been able to find after the war, and the many more he hadn't. All those unknown faces. All those moments of kindness that disappeared into history without record. The next day they visited the local cemetery. Marie led them to a section where resistance members were buried. Small plaques marked those who'd been executed by the Germans. Harmon walked slowly among the graves, reading names, dates, brief descriptions of how they died. Shot by firing squad for harboring Allied airmen. Died in Ravensbrück concentration camp for resistance activities. Executed for distributing underground newspapers. These were the people who hadn't been lucky. The ones who'd made the same choice as Madame Rousseau but had been caught. Their gamble with conscience had cost them everything. Harmon stood before the grave of the baker who'd been executed for hiding pilots. The man's widow was long dead now. But his grave was well maintained. Someone still cared. Someone still remembered. On his last day in France, Harmon asked Marie to drive him to the tree line where he'd buried his parachute 63 years ago. The field was still there, though it was smaller now, encroached upon by new construction. The tree line remained. They walked slowly across the field. Harmon's daughter supported his arm. Marie walked beside them. When they reached the approximate spot, Harmon stopped. Robert Harmon died in his sleep on January 8, 2008, 3 months before his 88th birthday. His daughter Sarah found him in the morning, peaceful in his bed, his memoir open on the nightstand to the chapter about France. The funeral was small. Family, a few veteran friends, neighbors who'd known him for decades. The local newspaper ran an obituary noting his service as a fighter pilot during World War II, his career as a flight instructor, his late-life advocacy for remembering the French resistance. Sarah found his papers boxed in the attic. Letters from Marie Rousseau. Photographs from his trips back to France. Documents about the resistance networks. A map showing the route he'd traveled from the crash site to Switzerland, with each safe house marked. Among the papers was a letter he'd written but never sent. It was addressed to Madame Rousseau, though she'd been dead for 40 years. The letter tried to express what he'd never adequately communicated in person. That she'd given him not just his life, but a model for how to live it. That her courage had echoed through every decision he made afterward. That he'd tried to be worthy of her sacrifice by being the kind of person who helped others without calculating the cost. Sarah read the letter alone in her father's study. When she finished, she understood something she'd never quite grasped before. Her father's insistence on helping anyone who needed it. His quiet generosity. His refusal to ever walk past someone in trouble. All of it traced back to an old woman who'd opened her door to a frightened pilot on an August morning in 1943. She organized her father's papers into an archive and donated it to a military museum. The museum created a small exhibit, The Invisible Army, Civilians Who Saved Allied Lives During World War II. It featured her father's story alongside dozens of others. Pilots who'd been hidden in attics. Soldiers who'd been smuggled across borders. Refugees who'd been sheltered despite the danger. The exhibit included photographs of resistance members. Madame Rousseau was there, a formal portrait from before the war showing a stern-faced woman in her Sunday dress. Beside it was the photograph of her farmhouse and the wardrobe with its hidden compartment. Visitors to the museum would stop at the exhibit. Read the stories. Look at the faces of ordinary people who'd done extraordinary things. Some visitors were veterans themselves. Others were families researching ancestors who'd participated in the resistance. Most were simply people interested in history. One day in 2009, a teenage girl stood before the exhibit with her grandmother. The grandmother pointed to one of the photographs. "That's my mother," she said. "She hit 4 Allied pilots during the war. I was a baby then. I don't remember any of it. But she told me about it when I was older." The girl studied the photograph. A young woman, perhaps 30, standing in front of a small house. She looked ordinary. Like any mother in any town. Was she scared? The girl asked. Terrified, her grandmother said. But she did it anyway. Because they were human beings who needed help. She said that was reason enough. The girl was quiet for a moment. Then, would you have done it? If you'd been her age during the war? The grandmother considered the question honestly. I don't know. I hope so. But you never really know until the moment comes. That's what made what they did so remarkable. They didn't know if they were brave enough until they had to be. And then they were. Stories like this played out in museums and classrooms and living rooms across America and Europe. The generation that fought the war was disappearing. Harmon's death was part of a great dying off of people who'd witnessed history firsthand. Soon, no living veterans would remain to tell their stories. But the stories themselves persisted. Passed down through families. Preserved in archives and exhibits and memoirs. Taught to new generations who would never know war but needed to understand the choices it demanded. In France, Marie Rousseau continued her grandmother's legacy quietly. She hosted visiting veterans who wanted to see the places they'd been hidden during the war. She gave talks at local schools about the resistance. She maintained correspondence with families of pilots her grandmother had saved. She never claimed heroism for herself. She was simply the granddaughter of a remarkable woman. A keeper of memory. A link between past and present. One letter she received in 2010 was from a young American soldier serving in Afghanistan. He was the great-grandson of Robert Harmon. He'd grown up hearing stories about the pilot who was saved by French civilians. His grandfather, Harmon's son, had told him these stories repeatedly. Be the kind of person who helps, he'd said. When you see someone in need, open the door. Don't calculate the cost. Just help. The young soldier had taken that lesson to heart. He wrote to Marie about how his great-grandfather's story had shaped his understanding of service. It wasn't about killing enemies or winning battles. It was about protecting people who couldn't protect themselves. About choosing conscience over convenience. He was killed by a roadside bomb 3 months later. He was 24 years old. Marie attended his funeral via video link. She watched his family grieve. She listened to the stories about his kindness, his commitment to helping Afghan civilians, his belief that individual acts of decency mattered. She recognized the echo. Her grandmother's courage had passed through generations, changing form but retaining its essential character. Madame Rousseau had never met Robert Harmon's great-grandson. But her choice to open the door in 1943 had shaped his life decades later in a country she'd never heard of. That was the true inheritance. Not money or property or family names. But the example of courage. The insistence that helping mattered. The stubborn refusal to close the door on someone who needed help. In 2015, the village where Madame Rousseau had lived installed a memorial plaque on the farmhouse. It listed the names of the 8 Allied pilots she and Pierre had hidden during the war. It noted that she'd never sought recognition for her actions. It concluded with a simple statement. She opened her door when others closed theirs. She chose courage when safety was easier. The ceremony was attended by perhaps 100 people. Children and grandchildren of resistance members. A few very elderly veterans. Historians who studied the escape networks. Sarah Harmon came from America with her children and grandchildren. They stood in the yard where Madame Rousseau had first seen the frightened pilot emerging from the wheat field. They tried to imagine that moment. The split-second decision. The wave of her flour-dusted hand. The simple gesture that contained everything worth remembering about human decency. Sarah's youngest grandson asked her a question. Great-grandpa could have died if she didn't help him? Yes, Sarah said. So we wouldn't exist if she didn't open the door? No, we wouldn't exist. The boy thought about that. Then, we should say thank you. We are, Sarah said. By being here. By remembering. By trying to be the kind of people who would open the door too. That evening, as the sun set over the farmhouse, Sarah stood alone in the field where her father had landed 72 years ago. She thought about the invisible chain of consequence that connected that moment to this one. A door opened. A life saved. Children born. Grandchildren. Great-grandchildren. All because one old woman decided that a stranger's life mattered more than her own safety. How many such moments occurred during the war? How many doors opened? How many strangers helped? How many invisible acts of courage never recorded, never celebrated, simply done because conscience demanded it? There was no way to count, no way to measure. The statistics recorded armies and battles and strategic decisions. They didn't record the woman who shared her bread or the man who forged identity papers or the family who hid a pilot in their wardrobe. But those acts mattered just as much, maybe more. Because wars end. Armies disband. Borders shift. Political systems rise and fall. But the example of individual courage persists. It echoes forward through generations, shaping how people understand what it means to be fully human. Not the calculated courage of soldiers following orders, but the spontaneous courage of civilians choosing conscience in the moment when it mattered most. Sarah walked back toward the farmhouse as darkness fell. Inside, through the lit window, she could see Marie preparing coffee for the remaining guests. An ordinary scene. An ordinary woman. Doing ordinary things. Just like her grandmother 7 decades ago. That's what heroism looked like. Not grand gestures or dramatic speeches. Just someone opening a door when they could have kept it closed. Someone sharing bread when they were hungry themselves. Someone risking everything because another human being needed help. The war had been over for 70 years. But its essential question remained. When your moment comes, when someone needs help and helping them puts you at risk, what will you choose? Safety or conscience? Self or others? The closed door or the open one? Madame Rousseau had answered that question with a wave of her hand on an August morning in 1943. Her answer echoed still.